All right. Well, I think it's time to taste our first wine. I'm getting thirsty and it's happy hour here on the East Coast. So I believe you said the Hickinbotham is the first wine that we should try in our little trilogy here. This is from the McLaren Vale in Australia. And I've actually toured Australia, South Australia, and it's one of my favorite places. I actually cried when I left. It was so beautiful. So I know everyone thinks of Shiraz, as they call it, as, the key red grape, but there are so many great Cabernet Sauvignons made there. Tell me a little bit about this challenge and why you were so excited to make this wine.
Well, I had been making wine in Napa Valley since 1995, and we acquired the Hickinbotham Vineyard in 2012. And, again, the opportunity to make wine in places around the world, winemakers would die to do. And to make wines, particularly from iconic vineyards like the Hickinbotham Vineyard, is an honor that you don't oftentimes get. And this vineyard has sourced for a lot of great Aussie wines over the decades. Penfolds, Grange, Penfolds, Bin 707, the 369, which is the Shiraz, Eileen Hardy's, Weir Angeles, Becker's Panel. There's so many people that have gotten fruit from there. I know Cabernet, right? So when I went there, the idea was what things can I grasp onto and what things do I really need to concentrate on learning that define this area differently than my reference point, which is Napa Valley. And for me, I know Cabernet. I know how to farm it. I know how to maneuver it during ripening to get the best possible outcome flavor-wise in the grapes. I know the diurnal shift effect that we get from the cold air moving in and out of the San Francisco Bay into the Napa Mountains. We have that same effect in McLaren Vale at Clarendon, where this particular vineyard is situated. We're at elevation, which is unusual from McLaren Vale. We're actually not too far from the Adelaide Hills, which is another GI of the South Australian region. And the spot that we are at get these breezes off the Gulf of St. Vincent every day, and it does the same kind of cooling effect and warm up in the morning and so on that we get in Napa. So those two things I grasped onto. What was the big difference for me was the soil profile. Here in Napa, our soils are either sedimentary soils, volcanic soils, a combination thereof, and all the underlying subsoils. And basic age 60 million years old. In our neck of the woods in McLaren Vale, the soils are 850 million years old. They're weathered. They're compact. They're dense. They have a tremendous amount of iron in them, and they treat the vines react differently in those environments. And that's what I had to concentrate on. And the great thing about the wine industry, as you know, Laurie, is that we love to share information. So I picked the brains of a lot of winemakers, a lot of vineyard managers. A few years before I got there, this map that's over my shoulder here had been developed, and that's a geology map of the McLaren Vale region. And a couple of the people that helped to develop this map actually still live in McLaren Vale, and I became friends with them. Picking their brains and understanding that soil and how it differs from the soils that I was accustomed to was the big challenge, and one that I love doing because I'm a science geek, I'm a farming geek, and all those kind of things, come into play. And then ultimately, how to bring the fruit to fruition so that it really expresses that place. It was the end goal, and it worked for me.
Yeah. And I was shocked to say that of the three wines in our three origins, Washington, California, and Australia, that this was the lowest of alcohol. What do you attest that to? Because it is also very, very warm climate, just like the other two. Is it the situation of this vineyard itself?
No, it is and it isn't. So there's a couple flavors that are generated by way of this vineyard, a couple more delicate flavors. There's like a rose petal and an orange blossom. There's like a little bit of an olive tapenade in the red fruit. To push that ripening further, you would lose that. And that's a real endemic character that I didn't want to lose. And you don't need to, you can push it further, and what really would happen, you get more raisiny characters versus more dark fruit characters. So in fact, that's one of the things that I learned working in this vineyard is you're not picking at 26 8.5 bricks. You're picking closer to 25 bricks to capture those characters and make sure you don't lose them. And that also affected some of my barrel choices and the percentage of barrels and the time on oak. I wanted to use more elegant oak so that it would accentuate those more delicate flavors and play up with them. And I don't put it on as much oak for the exact same reason that those flavors are a little bit more delicate. And you don't want to swamp them with oak characters.
I gotcha. And that was actually leads into a question that I had. Given that these are all different, but the same grape, that kind of blows people's minds in a way. What percentage of a final wine do you think is based on the place or the terroir versus what you can do as a winemaker to, assist that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Laurie. And I think it is different for every winemaker and every wine that's being produced. What keeps me focused and allows me to make wines in each one of these places and not have them come out and taste the same per each place is kind of my winemaking philosophy, which is all about farming and farming at the very highest level, farming to capture that sense of place. I make not only these 3 wines, I have another 4 wines in Napa that I make, and each one of those wines is defined by place. And knowing how place affects character and flavor is a key part of my job. And then when the wines come into the winery, keep the process as simple as possible. Because as soon as you start using the technology that's available or the technique, then it becomes more about winemaking. So, and that's fine, because there's plenty of wines that are like that, where a consumer goes into the supermarket and they want a wine every time they buy it that tastes the same. So you need to be able to manipulate that a little bit, right? And that's fine as long as they're buying wine. I don't have any problem with that. But my wines are about exploring place. So in our case, I would say, with these 3 wines, probably 20% is what I'm doing in the winery. 80% would be the place, and farming.
Yeah. And this is really elegant. I found and it was many years ago that I got the pleasure of, touring in South Australia, but I absolutely loved the wines and I was blown away about how much quality was there that we don't always see here in the States because it's just not brought in. And so I think to overlook Australian Cabernet, you're really missing out in that case. I also noticed that in true Aussie fashion, you're using a screw cap closure on this one, but not on your other 2. Was the thought specifically because that's what they do, or do you see this as a wine that's, a younger drinking wine?
A little bit of both. But I want to reflect on your first comment. There's a tremendous amount of great wine being produced in Australia. Not just Cabernet, Grenache in the lower part of the McLaren Vale region, Shiraz, Italian varieties, Semillon, Pinot Noir, Chardonnay. We don't see a lot of it over here. A lot of it driven by what the Aussies tried to do in the 90s and early aughts when they flooded our market with really inexpensive supermarket brands. And our perception of the quality of Australia kind of plummeted a little bit. But in fact, some of the greatest growing regions that I've ever been to are in Australia, and some of the most passionate and smartest winemakers that I have interacted with are Aussies. It is one of the things that I've always wanted how I approach this wine in presenting it is reminding people that Australia's a great place. You just got to give it a chance. And here are all the things that you could learn from that area. We went screw cap mostly because I want to sell more of this wine in Australia than I do in the US, and we only import back here, maybe 25% of this wine. Most of this wine is meant to sell in Australia, which is, the ultimate reward is if me coming from the US has an accepted brand in Australia, that makes me feel good.
Yeah, absolutely. And Riesling is another thing that I absolutely love.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
From the Pusey Vale is one of my favorites, but Henschke has an amazing Riesling as well. So there's some great whites too as well. All right, we're gonna move next to the Jet, but before we get to that wine, I'm wondering, climate change or whatever we want to call it, is absolutely happening. And that's got to be a different challenge for you based on these three different places. What are you seeing in Australia that you need to do? And then as we get into tasting a little bit more of these other, regions, we can talk about that. But what are you needing to do as a winemaker in Australia with regard to climate change?
Yeah, well, in Australia, they are a couple decades ahead of us dealing with this, and particularly in water use and bushfires. They've been dealing with a lot of the issues around drought and how to conserve water and how to make the best of what you have and grow plants that aren't as dependent on that. They've had bushfires that have impacted harvest a decade before we started dealing with this, really back in 2017. And labor, their labor situation is so much different than ours, and they've had to learn how to automate to keep the quality level of the wine, the grape production and the wines at the highest level. So those things are great jumping off points for learning, and then bringing those back here and how they think about it is something that I've done quite a bit of. You were talking about climate change and where we're going to go with that. In fact, the Jet wine, as a segue, was our venture into Walla Walla was because of climate change, particularly because of fires. We went up there in 2020 to look at property in Eastern Washington because the California, particularly Napa Valley and Sonoma County, our Cabernet was devastated that year. So there was no product that we were going to put together. So we needed to have a hedge, and Walla Walla was a great region to have a hedge. Now, in the West, there's oftentimes fires that impact great swaths of geography. But in this case, it's far enough away where we think we're protected from having the ability to have a product in any one year. In fact, right now I'm getting warnings on my phone because there's a fire right on the other side of our mountain over in Sonoma County by Ledson Winery. And it's already blown up to about 20 acres. It's only been going for a couple hours now. I'm freaking out because if that smoke starts drifting over here during this time of the grape ripening, then we've got a problem. So those kind of considerations are where we're looking, as a company, and Jet was one of those considerations. We've bought land recently in Canada and England, Oregon, where we have some of the greatest Pinot Noir and Chardonnay vineyards in the Willamette Valley. We're looking in Tasmania. Those two bands that circle the globe where it was ideal to grow grapes are moving towards the poles, and we need to be prepared for that.
Yeah. Now you brought up the Jet, so it's a perfect time to move to it right away. And I put my nose in here. Dark fruit is the first thing I'm connecting with here. But tell us where we're going with this Cabernet versus where we just were in the McLaren.
Yeah. So McLaren Vale is very much influenced by the Gulf of St. Vincent and the Mount Lofty Ranges and this gap where our little village of Clarendon sits at, and how that climate is shifted by way of that. Walla Walla is influenced by two major factors. One, and particularly in our area, which is in the Mill Creek area, this massive geologic event that you'll hear every Walla Walla vineyard manager and winemaker talk about, the Missoula floods, where the whole Yakima Valley or the whole Columbia Valley basin was this massive floodplain that captured this water that swirled around for hundreds of thousands of years. And when these glaciers that blocked it melted, all that water poured out, and all the sediment settled and created this soil profile that spans this massive area in eastern Washington. And those soils are fairly consistent. They're silty. They hold water fairly well, but they just have a consistency that grapevines do really well in. And it's just enough that they have that struggle effect. So there's that. Then where we are in Walla Walla, we're not in a Mediterranean climate, we're in a continental climate. We sit right up against the Blue Mountain Range, which is a north-south mountain range in the eastern Washington, eastern Oregon border. And right on the other side of that is Idaho. And so all that cold air that's on the Idaho side flows over into our spot. So it moderates the temperature there. Because generally, Walla Walla can be very warm if you're not getting that cold air flow from the other side of the Blues. So those two things affect the ripening. And we're at elevation. The part of Walla Walla that we sit at is about the same elevation as our mountain vineyards here in Napa, but you'd never know it. So you get that diurnal shift. It's just a different effect from that. And you get a little bit warmer. So that darker fruit aspect comes out, and that dustiness that you might be experiencing. It's almost like a Rutherford, Napa Valley Rutherford dust. That's the soil effect.
So interesting. I mean, I think, a tasting with these three side by side is so educational because, our brains do want to put everything in a bucket. Like, this is what Cab is, this is what Chardonnay is. And you just really can't, because it's so differently expressed by the place and even by the winemaker, because another winemaker could make this same grapes and this wine would be different as well. Correct?
Sure. But what ties these three together is that philosophy of farming, place, and simplicity. Those wines are approached the same way. And so what comes through is that sense of place. What's separating those wines is the place, and, it's not just me. One of the things that I think we're all attracted to about the wine world is the diversity of it, right? The continuing exploration on a yearly basis, on a geographic basis of all these places around the world that we make wine, and the different varieties that are produced there, and the different techniques that are utilized to create different expressions. It's all like one great continuing learning.
Yes, I always say if you meet anyone that says they know everything about wine, they absolutely know nothing about wine, because that's the thing you realize when you get into wine is that you're never going to know it all. You have to make peace with that. And then you're just always learning. You're just always learning something, and every year is different, and, things change. But I know one of the things that you've been changing and really passionate about is organic and sustainable winemaking.
Yeah.
And then the next step, which gets into your regenerative farming. And so tell me a little bit about, I know people hear these buzzwords probably from everybody these days, but I know you have a real commitment to that, and you guys are doing real tangible things in the vineyards with goats and owls and all kinds of fun things. So let people know how that plays into, the wines you make wherever they are in the world.
We have been pursuing organic viticulture now in Napa Valley for, let's say it's 8 years at this point. Here's the deal. The family that I work for is a multi-generational family, and they want to be around for another several hundred years in farming. My job is to make sure that the land that they depend on to produce the wines that they're producing is meeting that promise as well. And by pumping these great pieces of property with chemistry, you're taking a risk there that you're going to wear out the land, and that you're not going to be able to farm it the way it should be taken care of over time. And you think about the difference between an athlete on steroids and one that is 100% committed to natural health. And the steroid person will do really well for a little bit, but as soon as they go off those steroids, they crash. Whereas a healthier person will maintain their health for a long time in their approach to their lifestyle. It's the exact same thing with land and how we approach it, and what we're doing to maintain the biological integrity of our soils, of our environments, of our water sources. All those things come into play. And ultimately, it doesn't just help the land and the land owners, the people that I work for, but it helps the community, because all that stuff goes downstream. I live in a river valley. So when the rains happen, those rains move some of that process into the river, which goes into the bay, and it's a feedback loop that's not right. I want to do right by the company that I work for, the community that I live in, and the people that I care for who are drinking the wine. And ultimately, it's made the wines better. The risk with any of these things is that you're not going to produce the same kind of quality, or you're not going to produce the same kind of quantity. Well, quantity wise, when the vines are getting used to being organic, and now we're just about this close to getting our regenerative accreditation, they go through a little bit of a transition phase, much like somebody who is on steroids who has to learn how to be strong by just working hard. Right. Well, that's the same thing that happens in the vineyard. And we lost a couple of years worth of volume. But then once they get to that point, once they've acclimated to a different kind of input strategy, they come screaming back. And our volumes haven't changed from what it was pre. The great thing is our quality has ratcheted up. The intensity of fruit, the complexity has really elevated. And that's a great secondary attribute. I'm trying to save the planet, and then my wines are better all in the same shot. So, everybody wins.
So tell us about a few of those things I've read about, as far as, I think there were goats and I think there were ladybugs. How does that play into this?
So we bring in goats and sheep during the winter months to keep the vineyard floor mowed down. We don't till, so we need to have something that will keep control of the vegetation. And it's a win-win. By not tilling, the fungal networks that are under the soil stay intact. And those fungal networks are how plants communicate with one another. When you till the soil, turn it over, you're breaking up those fungal networks. So you want to preserve those. So you leave the valley or the vineyard floor untouched. Well, then you bring the goats in. They're not pumping carbon dioxide into the or carbon monoxide into the atmosphere. They don't leave a footprint like tractors do when you're pushing mowers behind them. And they actually leave something behind that actually helps the soil. They're done. So it's win-win. As soon as you get bud break, you got to get them out of there, though, because those buds are like chocolate to them. They'll go crazy. Oh. But then we use other IPM methods. IPM is the acronym for Integrated Pest Management, which is basically using other organisms to control bad organisms. Ladybugs are one of them. Ladybugs control a lot of the smaller insect species. We use predatory mites, which control the mites. Mites are these tiny, tiny little arachnids that can feed on the back of the plant, of the leaf blade. You use predatory mites, they will control the population. They won't get rid of them fully like chemistry will, but they'll control them that they won't affect the growth pattern of the plant. But also snakes. If I had somebody who was raising snakes, I would buy all their snakes and put them in the vineyard. Not the creepy ones, but the gopher snakes, because those control the rodent populations. And we have gophers are a big problem in California agriculture. So those are the things that we think about all the time. How do we utilize the natural world to help the agricultural world? How do we go in lockstep so that we're all on the same page and doing the right thing?
That's great. Our third in the lineup here is our Mount Brave, Mount Veeder cab. So we're headed to California, which I'm assuming that's where you're at right now.
I am.
But so we're rounding this out now and ending there in California. Of course, Mount Veeder is so infamous for its Cabernets. So tell me about this one and how it fits into the lineup.
So this is the Mount Veeder Cabernet from Mount Brave. This is actually different than the other two. The other two wines are 100% Cab. This has a little bit of Merlot, Malbec, Petit Verdot, and Cab Franc in it. It's still dominated by Cabernet, so we can still label it as Cabernet. And it is meant to express all the greatness of Mount Veeder appellation, which is blue fruits and violets and wet shale after a rainstorm minerality and structural components without being too onerous on the structural components. Mountain wines tend to have a good amount of tannin, and that tannin can make it a little more challenging for a restaurateur to serve younger mountain wines. This wine, with the addition of those other varieties, also I use softer clonal selections, tends to have a little little bit softer expression, so you can get all of the wonderful flavor components of a mountain wine without the tremendous amount of tannins. And it's meant to be, a wine that you can go to the local bottle shop and pick up and drink that night. Or if you're at a restaurant, the sommelier is going to feel comfortable serving this next to their food, rather than one of my wines, which is made on the collector side, and I don't pull punches on those tannins. So those are big boys that have to sit for a few years.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the tannin is there. So if you're going to have a steak, you're going to have something with that fat element, it's going to smooth that right out. But you aren't thinking, oh, I got to wait 10 years is what you're saying. This is okay. It's a 22, the one I have. So it's got, I guess, a few years on it here. Is there anything that you learned making the wines in either Australia or Walla Walla that you brought back to California and are doing now also where you're at? I'm sure you inspired or passed along some of your California techniques to your friends in those regions, but is there anything that you kind of said, geez, why haven't we been doing that?
Yeah, there certainly is. In Australia, more of the sensibility around oak usage. I've dialed my oak usage back, and picking, to be frank. I don't pick nearly as ripe as I once did here in Napa, because I've realized I don't need to, and I actually get more complex wines by picking a little bit earlier. Now in Napa, it's a little bit different because I have to also be cognizant of the tannins, and tannins, you need the grapes on the vine a little bit longer to modify those tannins. But that oak sensibility, lighter touch on the oak, more elegant oak, and picking is absolutely something I've brought back from Australia. In Walla Walla, it's about, I think one of the things that we've learned in Walla Walla is we not necessarily brought it back to California, but it's a very different climate environment from a cold management standpoint. They get winters, they get freezes versus frosts, which can kill vines. So how do you adapt to that? How do you protect those vines in those really cold environments? We've used a little bit of that understanding here during frost season, but really that's a whole unique aspect of dealing with viticulture up there that I don't have to necessarily deal with down here.
Yeah, that's great. And I mean, I think that is just like we were saying with wine, you're always learning. And as things change, you can bring in those new, practices or, other places. Do you think you'll ever do screw caps on any of these other cabs? Or do you think just the American mindset isn't there yet?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was actually in Australia last week, and I got into this discussion with some of my Aussie colleagues. There's a couple of things. One, when you go into the screw cap, obviously you don't have to worry about your wines being corked, but they don't age the same either, because there's no oxygen input as there is when you have a cork, and there's that little bit of oxygen that sneaks past the cork and the glass. With wines that are meant to be drunk earlier, and you're already seeing this, Sauvignon Blanc, there's a lot of Chardonnays that are now in screw cap here in the U.S. I think it's appropriate. With wines that are going to age, I don't know if we'll ever get there, and it's not only that part of it, the technical side of it, but there's the theater. You lose a little bit of the theater when a guy comes at you in Australia and goes like this versus, and then doing the whole, and there's something part of the theater of dinner, and the ritual aspect. That's important.
Yeah, and my friend Jim Burnett, who owns Willamette Valley Vineyards, where he comes down on the whole thing is that, and I don't know the exact study it's from, but that carbon footprint of a natural cork is less than a screw cap. So, and he helped start, you can recycle your corks at Whole Foods or recork. You can send them off, and they make floors and shoes and all kinds of cool things out of the corks. So just a fun question here. And these are all so elegant, but so different. And I love being able to taste these side by side. So thank you for that. And I highly recommend if you're listening to check that out as well. It would be a fun dinner party just to have these three over the course of a meal and just taste them side by side, because I think you really do learn. When you taste things sequentially, it's hard to go back and be like, oh yeah, this is a little more tannic or this is a little bolder. But I appreciate being able to do that here with you. But if you're home just on a random Wednesday night, what might I find you drinking and it can't be your own wine. It has to be something else.
Well, depending on what I'm doing that night, I might be drinking a Guinness stout because that's my favorite. That's my
Fun.
favorite beer ever. I tend to drink wine-wise during the week, white wines. And right now
Okay.
I'm exploring a lot of Chenin Blanc and Grenache Blancs because I think those varieties have some staying power in the market. They're interesting. They can be made several different ways, and they have a character that is unique to them, and that in some cases can age really well too. So
I agree. Love that. All right. And I know you've done all this winemaking all over the world. What's the one thing you're looking forward to that excites you? That's your next challenge? Is it your regenerative farming certification, or is there even something beyond that?
That's a good question. Well, speaking on Chenin, we just put together our first Chenin Blanc at Hickinbotham, and I made the blends. One of the reasons I was in Australia last week was to make the blends from the 26th vintage. Obviously, Australia, the 26th vintage is behind us, and the wines are fantastic, and I'm so excited about them, and I can't wait to get them in the market and turn people onto them. So that's my next exciting thing is that.
That is exciting. Well, keep me posted because I definitely will pick one up when it gets here in the States. Well, Chris, thank you so much for coming on The Sipping Point. I really enjoyed each and every one of these cabs, and I thought it was a really fun discussion about how the place changes the taste of the wine. And I appreciate everything you shared with us. And I just wanted to say thank you and cheers.
Cheers. Thank you, Laurie. Thanks for having me on.